You weren't a soldier with a chest full of ribbons in their eyes. Not when you carried envelopes instead of rifles. Not when your hands sorted bills and birthday cards instead of gripping a rifle stock. And that's exactly why the cadets laughed the morning she rounded the corner in her faded navy jacket, the canvas satchel heavy on her shoulder, walking with that careful, steady rhythm of someone who'd lived a very different life than they could ever guess. If you agree that respect should never expire, and that true service doesn't always wear a uniform, make sure to like and subscribe, because what unfolded that day on a quiet, sunlit road outside the federal training facility turned a simple mail route into a story none of them would ever forget. And it began with Rachel Donovan, 27 years old, barely past the age where most recruits were just learning to salute, but already carrying scars and memories she never spoke of, pieces of herself folded away like letters in a sealed envelope, invisible to everyone around her. To the world, Rachel was just the mail carrier who showed up rain or shine, trudging up steps with catalogs and pension checks, slipping envelopes into boxes while children biked past her without a glance. But inside her chest, she carried maps of old terrain, the smell of sand-baked earth, the burn of adrenaline in her throat when she'd crouched in places far from home. Her code name whispered through static radios by men who trusted her eyes to find safe paths through darkness. None of that mattered now, not to the smirking cadets who stood at the checkpoint gate that morning, leaning against steel posts with all the cockiness of youth, sharp haircuts gleaming under the sun, their voices quick and careless as they saw her approach. "Heads up, civilian traffic inbound," one of them shouted, and the others laughed, their mockery bouncing across the yard like gravel scattering beneath boots. Another added, "Careful with those flyers, mail lady, don't strain yourself." And Rachel said nothing, only shifted her satchel slightly higher, her stride never breaking. Her boots crunched the gravel deliberately, the way they always did, not fast, not slow, but measured. She adjusted her cap against the morning light and walked on, her eyes moving the way they always did, scanning shadows where others saw nothing, double-checking hinges and latches like a reflex, her gaze catching every detail the cadets ignored. They thought her cautiousness was clumsy, amusing. They didn't know it was survival reflex, learned years ago in another world, where one unscanned shadow could mean never coming home. Rachel Donovan hadn't asked for this job out of desperation. She'd chosen it because it was quiet, routine, anonymous. After leaving active duty at 25, after returning stateside with knees that still ached in the rain and nights that still flashed with memory, she wanted nothing more than to disappear into something steady. The postal route gave her that. Each morning she laced her boots, picked up her satchel, and walked the streets without anyone asking what she'd done before, without anyone looking too close at the scars on her arm or the distant calm in her eyes. People nodded at her without thinking. Neighbors waved absently. At most, she got polite small talk about bills or late packages. That's what she wanted, invisibility. But invisibility has a way of becoming dismissal, and dismissal a kind of cruelty, and she felt it sharpest that morning at the training facility, where the young recruits looked at her like she was scenery, background noise to their loud bravado, just the mail lady passing through their important world. One cadet whispered loud enough for others to hear, "Bet she's never even touched a weapon." Another laughed, "She walks like she's afraid of her own shadow." Their chuckles cut through the air, careless, easy, the kind of laughter that doesn't think it's cruel, but is. Rachel didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that silence can be stronger than defense, that responding only gave mockery something to feed on. So she kept walking, her shoulders squared, her eyes on the gate latch she checked twice without thinking, her body a map of habits ingrained by years most of these cadets were too young to understand. She knew they didn't see her. Not really. They saw the satchel, the faded jacket, the rhythm of her steps. They saw a mail carrier, nothing more. What they couldn't see was how her muscles remembered crawling under wire at 20, or how her lungs remembered holding breath through night patrols, or how her mind still counted exits in every room she entered. They couldn't see that her silence wasn't emptiness, it was restraint. That the patience in her gait wasn't weakness, it was control. But there was one man who saw. He stood near the edge of the yard, older than the recruits, his uniform crisp, but his eyes sharper than theirs, eyes that had seen enough to recognize something they couldn't. While the cadets joked, he stayed silent. his gaze fixed on Rachel as she crossed the gravel. Something about her pace, her posture, the way she carried herself even under their laughter. It triggered a memory he hadn't expected to resurface. The cadence of her steps, the way her hand brushed the satchel strap, like checking gear straps before a move. He knew those movements. They weren't the clumsy habits of a civilian. They were the unconscious reflexes of someone trained, someone tested. And as she reached the gate, the laughter still simmering behind her, he felt his spine straighten with recognition, so sudden it cut the air like a blade. Rachel paused just before the gate, pulling the satchel off her shoulder to retrieve the stack of envelopes destined for the administration office. She laid them on the counter with calm precision, ignoring the smirks, ignoring the whisper that called her postal princess. And then, in the heavy stillness that followed, the older Marine stepped forward. His boots struck the ground hard enough to silence the jokes. He stopped 3 feet from her, his body locking into posture, his hand rising to his forehead in a salute so sharp it startled the recruits into stillness. His voice rang out, not loud, not shouting, but carrying the kind of gravity that comes from certainty. "Nighthawk," he said, his tone cutting clean through the silence. Checkpoint cleared. The cadets froze. The laughter that had hung around the checkpoint evaporated in an instant, replaced by confusion, tension, and something else, fear. Nighthawk. They had no idea what it meant, but they understood immediately that it wasn't a joke. The Marine's eyes never left Rachel. His salute was crisp, reverent. His voice steady, almost reverential. And Rachel didn't move for a moment, her breath catching in her chest, because it had been years since anyone had spoken that name aloud. Years since she'd heard the call sign that once defined her life. Years since she'd been recognized not as Rachel the mail carrier, but as the forward recon specialist who had led patrols through landscapes these cadets couldn't even imagine. Slowly, she exhaled, her eyes meeting his, and though she said nothing, the silence between them was enough. She had been seen. Behind them, the recruits exchanged uncertain glances. One muttered, "What did he just call her?" Another whispered, "Nighthawk? Who the hell is Nighthawk?" The young officer at the gate scoffed, trying to cover his unease. "Probably some old nickname. She's just a mail carrier." But his voice lacked conviction, because deep down, everyone there felt it. The way the air had shifted, the way the Marine's words carried something heavier than nostalgia. They had mocked her seconds ago, and now they stood silent, watching, realizing they might have just laughed at someone whose history could crush their pride. Rachel didn't correct them. She didn't explain. She only lifted the satchel back onto her shoulder, gave the Marine the smallest of nods, and walked past the gate with the same calm, steady steps she'd started with. But the silence left behind was different now. It wasn't mockery. It was unease. It was the beginning of respect. Because one phrase, "Nighthawk, checkpoint cleared," had torn the veil, and for the first time in years, Rachel Donovan wasn't invisible. She was exactly who she had always been, only now, they finally saw her. The whispers didn't stop after she passed through the gate. They only grew sharper, traded in low voices between recruits who had been laughing minutes before, but now stared at each other with unease. The name still echoing like a riddle they couldn't solve. Nighthawk. And though none of them dared say it aloud where she could hear, they repeated it under their breath, tasting it like a secret code meant only for those who'd earned the right to know. While Rachel walked steadily toward the administration office, her satchel resting easy against her hip, her heart beating a little faster than she would admit, because hearing that name again was like having a locked door flung open inside her chest, letting the ghost spill out. Ghost she had packed away when she left active duty 2 years earlier. Ghost that smelled of oil and dust and nights under stars too sharp to belong to any sky she would see here. The recruits tried to laugh it off, some saying the Marine had mistaken her for someone else, others insisting it was some kind of inside joke, but the way his salute had cracked through the yard wouldn't leave their minds. And when Lieutenant Mercer, the loudest voice among them, tall, decorated, convinced of his own importance, finally spoke up, his words were coated with mockery just thin enough to hide the uncertainty underneath. "Nighthawk? Please. She's delivering junk mail, not calling airstrikes." And though a few cadets chuckled with him, their laughter didn't have the same bite, because Mercer's bravado was covering something they all felt but didn't want to name. the possibility that they had misjudged the quiet woman in the postal blues. Rachel heard none of it as she laid the envelopes on the counter inside, her movements calm and deliberate, her face betraying nothing of the storm that phrase had stirred inside her. But the older Marine, Sergeant First Class Daniel Harland, watched her, his eyes steady, because he hadn't spoken those words lightly. He had spoken them because he knew, because once, years ago, he had seen a reconnaissance team vanish into the desert under cover of night, and he had heard the call sign that carried back across static radios when their leader reported in. Night Hawk, checkpoint cleared, for words spoken with calm precision by a voice that belonged to someone far younger than most believed could carry that kind of responsibility, a voice he never forgot. And now here she was, in front of him again, pretending to be nobody, and Harlan couldn't let that pass. By mid-morning, the whole facility buzzed with speculation. Stories stretched and twisted as they always do, some claiming she had once been CIA, others muttering she was some kind of myth, a phantom soldier hiding in plain sight. And Rachel, as always, said nothing. But silence doesn't erase truth, it sharpens it. And that's why, when the alarm klaxons blared that afternoon, cutting across drills with a shrill urgency, all eyes turned instinctively toward the officers, waiting for orders. But it was Rachel who moved first, her satchel already on the ground, her eyes fixed on the flashing light at the east gate. The announcement crackled over the PA, suspicious package detected, quadrant free, lockdown initiated, and the cadets scrambled, half-trained and nervous, their voices colliding in confusion, Mercer barking orders without clarity. Form perimeter, double up the checkpoints. But his words carried no weight, no direction, just noise. Rachel didn't shout. She didn't rush. She simply walked straight toward the commotion, her steps calm, her hands steady, the same way she had walked through mine-laced roads years before, scanning, observing, breathing evenly. "Ma'am, step back," one recruit called, his voice high with fear, but she didn't. She crouched by the fence where the small, nondescript package sat, wires barely visible against the gravel. And in that moment the years fell away. The uniform didn't matter. The satchel didn't matter, because this was who she was. This was what she had trained for. "Don't touch it," Mercer shouted. But Rachel was already pointing, not at the package, but at the disturbed dirt a few feet away, her voice calm but cutting through the chaos. "Secondary trigger, pressure plate. Get everyone back." The recruits froze, staring at her like she'd spoken a language they'd never heard. But Harlan's voice thundered immediately after hers. "You heard her. Move." And suddenly the cadets obeyed, scattering back, forming a perimeter not because Mercer barked, but because Rachel's quiet certainty carried the weight of experience. She leaned closer, not recklessly but with trained precision, her eyes following the wiring pattern, her hands sketching shakes in the air, explaining quietly to the EOD team that arrived seconds later. "It's old, improvised, built to distract from the real entry point. Check the drainage culvert, west side." They blinked at her, then rushed to check, and sure enough, another device, larger, hidden where no one had thought to look, lay waiting. Without her, they would have missed it, and the drill, or what they thought was a drill, would have ended in disaster. By the time the area was secured, Rachel was standing quietly to the side, dust on her knees, her hands folded loosely, saying nothing as the officers converged, demanding answers. Mercer tried to reassert himself, accusing her of recklessness. "You could have gotten yourself killed, or worse, gotten in the way of trained personnel." But his voice faltered when Harlan stepped forward, his jaw tight, his words heavy. "She is trained personnel. She was trained before you ever laced boots, Lieutenant. That's Night Hawk." Silence fell heavier than the alarm had been, because the truth wasn't rumor anymore. It wasn't whispered speculation. It was spoken aloud by someone who had earned the right to know. And now every cadet, every officer in earshot realized the woman they had dismissed that morning as a joke had just saved them with eyes sharper than their drills and instincts sharper than their technology. Rachel didn't smile, didn't revel in the silence. She only picked up her satchel again, brushed the dust from her knees, and walked away, leaving behind a yard full of young recruits staring at her with the dawning recognition that respect doesn't come from stripes, or loud orders, or polished boots. It comes from what you do when it matters. And when the alarms fade and the danger is real, sometimes the quietest person in the room is the only one who knows how to survive. By the time the sun began to dip behind the tree line that evening, the base had changed, though its gates and fences looked the same. The barracks still hummed with young voices, and the drills still echoed across the yard. There was a hush threaded through it all now, a silence born from revelation, because whispers about Night Hawk had spread faster than wildfire. The story of the suspicious package, the calm way the mail carrier had walked straight into danger, the precision with which she had read the wiring, the way she had spoken only a handful of words but saved everyone inside the perimeter, and by nightfall, her name, her real name and her call sign, were spoken not with mockery but with reverence. Rachel Donovan, the woman they had laughed at hours before, now moved through the facility under watchful eyes, not of derision but of respect so sharp it bordered on awe, though she didn't ask for it, didn't want it. Her satchel once again slung across her shoulder as though nothing had changed, because for her it hadn't. She was still the mail carrier, still the woman who preferred anonymity, who preferred silence to ceremony. But the silence now carried weight, and as she stepped out of the administration building, the young recruits who had taunted her that morning stood quietly to the side, their eyes lowered, their posture stiff, each of them replaying their laughter in their heads, ashamed at how they had mistaken patience for weakness. Lieutenant Mercer, red-faced and hollow-eyed, tried to cling to authority, muttering that one lucky guess doesn't make her a soldier. But his words didn't travel, didn't root, because Sergeant Harland was already speaking to the colonel in hushed tones, and soon after, the commanding officer himself emerged, a stern man rarely given to praise, his gaze sharp as he stopped Rachel on the gravel road. "Donovan," he said, and though the recruits expected him to scold her for interfering, his voice carried something else, something heavier. "Why didn't you tell them?" Rachel stood steady, her satchel strap creaking softly under her fingers, and answered simply, "Because I didn't come here to be remembered. I came here to live." The colonel studied her for a long moment, then gave a single nod, not the stiff kind reserved for civilians, but the slow acknowledgement reserved for equals. He turned to the recruits then, his voice carrying across the yard. "Let this be your lesson. Valor doesn't vanish when the uniform comes off. It becomes invisible, and it waits. Today it saved you." And just like that, the weight of what she had carried, invisible all these years, landed squarely on the shoulders of those too young to understand until now. That night, in the mess hall, Rachel sat at a quiet corner table with her sandwich, her presence as unassuming as ever. But when she stood to leave, chairs scraped back in unison, every recruit rising silently, offering crisp salutes without a word. She paused, her breath catching in her throat, her eyes stinging though she didn't let them see it, and she gave the smallest nod before walking on, her boots steady, her shadow stretching long across the corridor. Behind her, the salutes dropped only after she had disappeared. Later, when the lights dimmed and the base fell quiet, the recruits gathered around Harland, hungry for stories, for confirmation, for answers about who she had been. He told them only what he could. That she had been 22 when she led reconnaissance teams through hostile terrain, that she had been the one to call in coordinates under fire that saved dozens, that she had been known by one name across the comms, Night Hawk. The rest, he said, wasn't theirs to know. And as they sat in silence, the weight of their earlier laughter pressed down on them harder than any drill instructor's bark could. Rachel didn't hear their stories, didn't need their apologies. She walked home the way she always did, the night cool against her skin, her satchel swinging gently, and, though her life would return to the rhythm of mail routes and small talk at doorsteps, she knew something had shifted, not in her, but in them. Because for once, they had seen through the thin veil of assumption, through the dismissal and the mockery, into the truth she had carried quietly all along. And that truth, once seen, could never be unseen. She didn't need medals pinned again, didn't need applause or ceremony. Respect, once lost, had been reclaimed not through words, but through action, the same way it always had. And so the story ended where it began, with Rachel Donovan walking a road no one thought mattered, her boots crunching steady against the gravel, her silhouette blending into the quiet of evening. But this time, every step echoed differently in the minds of those who watched, because they knew now that sometimes the mail carrier isn't just delivering letters. Sometimes she's carrying history, courage, and scars you'll never see, until the moment they save your life.